Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Jac.
And I'm Nat.
And today, brace yourselves, because it's going to be a tough topic.
Yeah, it really is. I know we say that like a lot of episodes, but this was probably one of like the most difficult subjects to research. I had to like take a lot of breaks. However, it like everyone should know about this. We've seen it in the news a lot recently, but before I reveal what the topic is, I just want to announce that this episode is a super special episode, actually. We're in collab with the Scrolls and Leaves podcast, hosted by Gayatri and Mary Rose. Jac, do you want to talk about like what their podcast?
Yeah, so the Scrolls and Leaves podcast covers history on the margins, so lesser known topics in history. So if you're interested in that, which if you're listening to How Did We Not Know That, we assume you are, then be sure to check them out. We're going to link their podcast in the description below, and you should be able to find them wherever you listen to podcasts.
You guys should definitely check them out. And we're doing an episode swap. So they are, in this episode, Jac and I, are going to be covering the residential school system in Canada, but the Scrolls and Leaves podcast will be covering residential schools in the U.S. So in order to get like perspectives of both of those histories, you got to check out both episodes. So again, the episode and their podcast will be linked in the description. Yeah, please check them out. And thanks again to Gayatri and Mary Rose. Okay, so before the episode, I have our like preliminary question. I think you actually might know I think you know the answer to this already, Jac, but the question for this episode is, when was the last residential school in Canada closed?
Oh, in Canada?
Yeah.
I want to say 1970s.
1970s. Okay. Okay, well, you have to wait until the end of the show, but 1970s is a good guess. Jac, do you know a lot about residential schools? Do you know what they are? At least residential schools in Canada.
Yeah, not much about Canadian residential schools, but American ones, yes. They were where Native Americans would be sent to be assimilated into mainstream white American culture, and so it was pretty horrific, where they would just erase the history of Native Americans with their children. I don't even know if the children were there by consent. I don't know if they just were forced to enroll. So,
yeah.
Anyways, open to learning today.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's a really good description. It is really, pretty much what you described, and I'll answer that. Is it consensual or non-consensual in a bit? But so many listeners might have like heard about residential schools recently. That's because it's being discussed a lot in Canada, like within the past couple months, and that's because recently, more than 1,300 unmarked graves were discovered at former residential school sites in Western Canada. So these children were buried, and there's no markings of like where they were buried. The bodies were found using ground-penetrating radar technology, but this technology was only used at 4 of the 139 federally run residential schools. So who knows how many graves there actually are and how many children have been buried. So currently the official number of students who are known to have died at these residential schools is 4,120. But it's widely believed that like this is only a small portion of the number. Estimates go as high as like 15,000. As we're able to make like more discoveries through the improvement of technology, then I guess we'll get a better estimate. But I mean, you could see like 4,000 to like 15,000. That's a huge jump. So
Right.
Yeah, and like as this news is breaking, there have been some people that are arguing that the children buried, most of them just died of diseases like tuberculosis, and the schools that they were living at, like they did the best they could to provide education and medical care to these children during a time when like their communities back home were also being devastated by similar diseases. So they're like, oh, well, they could have gotten sick either way. And I know, like, Jac and I try to be, like, unbiased when it comes to, like, arguments, like, in current events, but I'm gonna dispute this one, like, right off the bat, and, like, this whole episode is kind of, like, showing that's really not the case. The conditions at the residential schools were the primary reason for these deaths. And yeah, so that's like the whole episode's gonna be about basically. But before I continue, I wanna like give a brief side note about terminology. So at the time, the Canadian federal government used terms such as Indians to describe Indigenous peoples of Canada. So although the term Indian is no longer considered appropriate to describe people, I'm going to be using this word only when it appears in names, but otherwise I will be using the term Indigenous peoples, which is an umbrella term for First Nations, Inuits, and Métis people living in Canada. So if you're not familiar, like I think most Americans are probably not familiar with those words as well, like what is First Nations, Inuits, and Métis? So I'm going to give like a quick background on that. So First Nations is a word to describe most but not all reserve-based communities in Canada. Like that's how most groups refer them to themselves as First Nations. However, Métis and Inuits are not included in this category. So Inuits are historically located in the Arctic and are legally and culturally distinct from First Nations and Métis. A lot of people will be familiar with the term Eskimos. However, like this is no longer an appropriate term for the Inuit people. So yeah, they would prefer to be referred to as Inuits.
Yeah, it's not appropriate.
Yeah, anymore. It's no longer appropriate. Yeah. So the correct term is Inuits, and the singular form of that is Inuk. So there you go. And then Métis are a specific Indigenous group in Canada that until very recently have not been regarded as quote-unquote Indians under Canadian law, and they're never considered First Nations. They are people of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry across Canada. So those are like the three main groups. That's interesting. Yeah. So now you know a little bit more about that. So
yeah. Thank you, Nat, for that lesson. That was really important. It's a lot of terms I wasn't familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not living in Canada, I'm sure it's like most people aren't aware of that terminology. But yeah, so mostly throughout the episode, you'll hear me use the term Indigenous peoples. But just so you know, those are other terms that you can use. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the history of these residential schools. So starting in 1883, and I'm not going to tell you when it ends till the end of the episode because that answers our question, but starting in 1883 and throughout the duration of the residential school systems, more than 150,000 children were taken from their homes and placed in distant boarding schools where the focus was on manual labor, religious instruction, and cultural assimilation. So these schools were set up by the Canadian government and they were administered by the Catholic Church. Their goal was to indoctrinate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian Christian ways of living, assimilate them into white Canadian society. And there's pretty much a kind of like a slogan, a quote that kind of really summarizes what the aim of the school was. The quote is,
"Kill the Indian, save the man."
You already know it. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Kill the Indian, save the man.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. Wow. That was impressive.
I forget where I learned that.
Wow.
Yeah. I think maybe you said that actually before. Maybe you told me that in our previous episodes.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But, wow, you remember. Maybe. I don't know.
Or maybe Indeep did it on the guest episode. I swear it was on a previous episode.
It could have been on her episode when we were talking about...
Yeah.
Forced sterilization, yeah. Okay, well.
What did we do to the Native Americans?
Yeah. You guys should check that episode out. But, so I have a quote from a former residential school student. Her name is Florence Barvier. She said, quote unquote, "They made us believe we didn't have souls. They were putting us down as people, so we learned to not like who we were," unquote. So it was really getting to, like, the heart of who you were as a person, and, like, what value you have in society, which is horrifying. And these schools operated in every Canadian province except for New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. The authorities, like, would forcibly separate the children from their families for extended periods of time, and they forbade them from acknowledging their Indigenous culture and heritage or to, like, speak their own languages. So they were not allowed to speak their Indigenous language. They had to speak English or French, I think, maybe, depending on where they were in Canada. The children at the school suffered from physical and sexual abuse, as well as malnutrition, disease, and neglect. And also, I mean, these are supposed to be schools, like, forms of education. However, the students were provided with, like, inadequate education, oftentimes only up until lower grades. So it was like their teachings were mainly focused on manual labor and prayer, or, like, agriculture, like woodworking and, like, domestic work. Like, they weren't actually receiving the same education as other Canadian children. And so if you're wondering, like, why and how these schools were created, I mean, pretty much since Europeans came to North America, they thought that they needed to, quote unquote, civilize Indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of where the idea for these schools came from. Canada's first Prime Minister, John Macdonald, commissioned a study of industrial schools for Indigenous children in the U.S. So Canada actually got the idea from the U.S. So, yeah. And in the 1880s, the government began to open residential schools across Canada. And then in 1920, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Indigenous child to attend a residential school, and it was illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. So then authorities had the right to take children from their communities forcibly, and they, like, frequently exercised this right. So once students were...
So it's not consensual.
Yes, it is not consensual.
That answers that question.
Which I, like, how horrifying is that? Like, if you're a parent and, they take them away from you and you, like, don't have communication. That's the really awful thing that we'll get to later is, like, some people never hear back from their children again, and they never know what happens to them.
Yeah. I remember reading an article that was talking about a child that had been adopted by a white family, but what happened is they just stole the child from their Native American family and then forced them into the residential schools, and then a white family adopted them. But at that point, too, the child doesn't remember their native tongue either, so a lot of the children will forget how to even communicate with their parents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Just a side note.
No, like, we're gonna get into that later in the episode, but that's what happened. And that's kind of how this school system transitions to eventually is, like, child welfare and, like, putting kids into adoption rather than putting them into schools. But we'll get into that. But for now, when we're focusing on residential schools, like, once the students get to this school, they have their hair cut short, they're dressed in uniforms, and oftentimes they're, like, given numbers to identify themselves. Their days were strictly outlined by timetables. Boys and girls were separated, and even siblings rarely interacted, which, like, further weakens those family ties. So Chief Bobby Joseph of the Indian Residential School Survivors Society Like when he talks about the residential school that he attended, he says that he had no idea how to interact with girls, and he never even got to own his own sister beyond like a mere wave in the dining room. So again, I have no words. Like, this is tragic.
Yeah, it's just a nightmare.
It is a literal nightmare.
I can't imagine.
No.
I feel like, I don't know about you, but even growing up in America, you know, everyone speaks English. Sometimes I feel a bit robbed by not getting to know the languages like my mom spoke or anything. So I can't imagine you physically got taken away from your family and everything about your culture is erased. So yeah, that must have been really tough. There's no words.
Yeah, there's
to
no
explain
words.
how
And like
horrific that must be.
And now you see like there are so many Indigenous languages that are so close to being extinct, and there's people from that heritage that are like desperately trying to revive the language or like just keep it preserved, you know, like keep it from dying out. And like the reason it's dying out is because of things like this, because of like all this like forced assimilation and like cultural eradication. So yeah, it is a nightmare.
Right. And it's so different. It's not just, you know, for like other immigrants, it's not like the language is being erased from where you came from, but this is their home, and you're erasing it from their home.
Yeah.
So it's like all this history and culture that completely gets eradicated from history and society. Yeah,
and like that's like that's irreversible, you know? Like when a culture gets completely destroyed, like I don't know, it's really horrifying. Like another scary aspect of this like manual labor based education is that the work that they were doing, so like girls were focusing on more domestic work, like laundry, sewing, cooking, cleaning, and then boys were taught like more like manual labor, like carpentry, farming. And so like classes were part-time, and then they worked part-time. So it's like half work, half class. The work they did was like involuntary and unpaid. And they were like, oh, like this is like practical training for you so that you'll develop skills. But like a lot of the residential schools couldn't run without the work that these children were doing to like they were like basically running the schools themselves. So it's almost like, and it's unpaid and involuntary. So you're getting into like more of like a forced labor aspect of this too, which is
forced child labor.
Forced child labor.
Wow.
And then like on top of everything, because they're spending such little time in class, by the age of 18, like most of the children had only received an education up to grade 5, which is like Canadian grade 5. I don't know what that translates to in like American education. Is it just 5th grade? I don't know if it's the same grade 5, 5th grade.
Probably so.
Yeah.
I heard that in Canada they start students younger. So that could be a bit more advanced than Americans. But grade 5 is still grade 5.
Yeah.
You know?
And like they're 18, and it's like, I don't know. They're like, oh, this is a school, but it's not even a school. Like they're not teaching them. And so now we're going to like shift over to more of the health aspect of residential schools. In 1907, Indian Affairs Chief Medical Officer Peter Bryce reported some disturbing findings to his superiors. He had visited 35 government-funded schools in Western Canada, and Bryce reported that 25% of all children who attended those 35 schools had died. At one school, the number was as high as 69% of students had died.
Oh my God.
Like just extremely high death rates. And so furthermore, many of the children who were extremely sick were just sent home. Like they didn't even stay at the school. So like the number of children who died because of the conditions at the residential school is even higher than what he was reporting. So Bryce said that of the children who were sent home and then subsequently sent to a hospital, 47% to 75% of those students died shortly after returning home. So does that make sense? Like, the really sick students got sent home, and then up to 75% of those students died. On top of the 25% who died at the schools. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Wow.
And so Bryce did say that the cause of death was mostly tuberculosis, but he didn't say that the disease was like natural or inevitable. Instead, he put the blame on the schools themselves because they were poorly constructed, they lacked proper ventilation, and they frequently housed sick students in the same bedrooms alongside their healthy classmates. Because of the poor conditions, they have a higher mortality rate.
Oh, sorry. This is just a side note. We don't have to keep this in. But, like, when I was in South Africa, I think I told you that there was a refugee crisis. So they took refuge in a church and then were living there. And then before I left, it was becoming apparent that a lot of the children in that church were getting tuberculosis. And I had to go visit to give aid. And the conditions were so horrible. In order for tuberculosis to be spreading among children like that in an enclosure, the conditions are like there's no airflow at all. Everyone's packed in like sardines. It's not clean. So I can't imagine just the lack of proper care within those schools to have such high rates of tuberculosis transmission.
Yeah, I mean, if you saw that, like, firsthand, how poor the conditions have to be. It has to be really extreme. I don't know, like, the situation you're in, like, that's a response to, like, an emergency, like, crisis, you know? And, like, these were, like, constructed on purpose, and yet the, like, quality was still so poor. So it's just, like, that's really, like, cruel, you know?
Yeah, and what's super frustrating is that kids can't consent to that.
Yeah.
Or kids, even the parents didn't consent to that either, but, you know, kids don't have a choice, so they are not doing anything wrong, and they're having to go through all of this.
They have no power. Like, I mean, they're kids. Like, they get there, and, like, their parents don't have any control. Their authorities and their communities don't have any control, and then it's their children. Like, what do you do? Okay, so Bryce wasn't the only one to say anything about the schools. So over the 100-year history of the residential schools, there were school inspectors, medical officials, principals, and Indian agents who repeatedly issued warnings about unhealthy conditions in the schools. And these unhealthy conditions include, like, inadequate medical facilities, non-existent isolation rooms, lack of school nurses, overcrowded and dilapidated buildings with poor ventilation and insufficient heating, as well as inadequate nutrition provided to students, or just malnutrition, which makes them more vulnerable to disease. So later the Canadian government collected testimony from survivors of the residential school system. One of these former students was Andrew Paul, and he described his time at the Aklavik Roman Catholic residential school in the Northwest Territories. He says, quote unquote, "We cried to have something good to eat before we sleep. A lot of the times the food we had was rancid, full of maggots," unquote. So, yeah, oh my God. And if you're starving and this is like the food you're forced to eat, like, you don't have a choice. And then the little food you are being given is, like, not nutritionally adequate. And the malnutrition that these students were suffering from, in the case of tuberculosis, the malnutrition that these students were suffering from leads to significantly higher mortality rates among infected individuals. So it has, like, obviously malnutrition has a lot of negative health effects on you. And like government and church authorities, this is like kind of disputed over, but there is a lot of evidence that shows that government and church authorities were well aware of the extent of hunger and malnutrition in the schools, like both before and after Bryce's report. And so in the 1940s, a series of inspections by the Federal Nutrition Division found that there was widespread malnutrition at all of these schools. However, like, so they tried to improve the training for school cooks, but this fails. And like, instead of, I don't know, trying again or like trying a different approach to improve it, they decide to use the poor health of the children as an opportunity to study the effectiveness of a variety of experimental nutrition interventions into the diets of malnourished children. So they literally do experiments on 1,000 children in 6 residential schools between 1948 and 1952. None of these experiments did anything to address like the underlying cause of malnutrition, which is insufficient quantity and quality of food. Instead, they were just trying to like test out different effects that malnutrition has on a child, which is really horrifying and disgusting.
Yeah.
And so like,
and illegal. How is that legal? It's not.
Well, it's like funded by the government, so it's like,
that's horrible.
Yeah.
Non-consensual experiments? What?
On children. On malnourished children.
Yeah.
Like, that's a different type of evil.
Yeah.
That is straight out of nightmares. Like, you said that earlier, and that's just, like, what I keep thinking. Like, this is all just, like, a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
So...
Oh, man. I can't imagine... Just, like, side note, like, the grief... Not only... Like, obviously the children are experiencing horrific times, and then the grief of the communities who are the parents of those children. Can you imagine how much like pain you have to go through knowing that this happened to your child, or not knowing how your child is being treated? And
you don't even know if you're like, some people don't even know if like your children's alive, and if they do die, it's like, how did they die, when? Like, that's an unthinkable horror. Like, that's an unimaginable pain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, like, that's something that it's, like, that...
There's no way to take that
there's no way to
away.
take that back, and there's nothing... Yeah, there's no way to take that back. It's... Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
So I guess... Okay, so let's get into the... like funding details. So the per capita federal grant provided for food in most residential schools was usually half of what is required to maintain a balanced diet. So they only had enough for like half a meal for students. And like, just like overall, these schools were always underfunded. In 1938, the Manitoba Home for Boys received $550 per student. And then American Indian boarding schools in the U.S., students received $350. There's $350 per student. But then the Indian Affairs back in Canada paid $180 per student. So compared to like $550 that like regular Canadian students were getting, $350 for Indigenous students in the U.S., and then $180 for Indigenous students in Canada. So Canada, like the federal government was paying even less compared to the U.S., which actually really surprised me.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Even less than an already underfunded school. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. It just keeps getting worse because by the 1940s, students with tuberculosis were sent from residential schools to hospitals. But these hospitals were racially segregated Indian hospitals. They were typically sent without their parents' knowledge or their parents' consent, and they often stayed there for years at a time. And these hospitals, these quote-unquote Indian hospitals, much like residential schools, were funded at a much lower rate, often just 50% of the per capita cost for non-Indigenous patients in Canada. And so obviously the healthcare that is provided to these Indigenous children was substandard. And also, like, a lot of Indigenous patients, not just children at these hospitals, were more likely to receive permanently debilitating surgeries and, like, kept in the hospital for much longer compared to non-Indigenous patients. And this is partly because of a belief that, like, Indigenous patients couldn't be quote unquote trusted to follow a drug regime at home. And then also, like, specifically with children, it was like another way for the federal government to, like, assimilate Indigenous people, because it's like the longer you're away from home and, like, the longer they can keep you in a hospital, like, the more likely they are to break your connections to your home communities and, like, connections to your language. So it's just another way to, like, force you away from your home community and, like, assimilate to white Canadian culture. And then these hospitals, oftentimes, like, they had little communication with families about the condition of a child's health. Many hospitals didn't inform parents when a child died. They didn't tell them where they were buried, or, like, why they passed away. And so to this day, many families still have no idea what happened to loved ones who left for these institutions and never returned. And so on that, like, really sad note, we're going to transition into how these schools finally got shut down. So let's see how that finally happened. By the 1950s, officials began to doubt the residential school system because the devastating effects were becoming more widely recognized. So in 1951, the Canadian government made amendments to the Indian Act, and so that half work, half school system was abandoned, and instead they transitioned from a school system into a child welfare system. And so this is kind of like what you mentioned, what you brought up earlier. This, like, time period is referred to as the 60s scoop because of the mass systemic removal of Indigenous children from their families without the consent of their parents or authorities. So basically, like, Canadian authorities would go into Indigenous communities and say, oh, this is not a fit home for a child. We're, like, kind of like Child Protective Services, like, we're taking your child out of this home, like, it's not safe for them to be here, and so you no longer have control over your child, and so we're taking your child and then we're putting it up for adoption. And almost all of the time they are being placed into white middle-class families, and this is just a further attempt to assimilate them into white Canadian cultures. This practice, as well as, like, the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare systems, continues today. So if you look at Canadian child welfare systems, there's a huge number of Indigenous children in child welfare. And then most of these children are being placed into white families. So that's just, like, another way. They kind of just masked it. Like, now they're not, like, putting kids into schools. Now they're just taking them out of your house and giving you to another family. So in 1969, the Department of Indian Affairs took exclusive control over the residential school system, which marked an end to church involvement in this school system. However, like, the schools remain underfunded, abuse continued, and many teachers and workers continued to lack proper credentials to carry out their responsibilities. In the meantime, the Canadian government began to desegregate schools. So they began to incorporate Indigenous children into public schools. But many Indigenous students struggled to adjust to public school and to like a Eurocentric system where Indigenous knowledges were excluded, and they felt discriminated by non-Indigenous students. And post-secondary education was still strongly discouraged for Indigenous students. Starting in 1969, residential schools in Canada began to decline in numbers. And dun, 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 the answer to today's question, in 1996, Gordon Reserve Indian, 1996. Gordon Reserve,
no. It sounded like it was, wow, it took a while for them to close them all.
Yeah.
Like almost 30 years.
Yeah. 1996, like that's crazy. And the last school was Gordon Reserve Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. It was closed and then demolished. So the residential school system lasted for almost 150 years. 1996. Wow. That's so recent. And so I guess
is very recent, yeah.
Yeah. To wrap up, I want to talk about like efforts towards reconciliation and like acknowledgement. So it really wasn't until the late 1980s that the Canadian legal system began to respond by allegations of abuse brought forward by survivors, specifically towards sexual abuse. So out of the 38,000 claims of sexual and physical abuse submitted to the courts, there were fewer than 50 convictions made. So fewer than 50 people were found guilty of abuse out of 38,000. So,
whoa.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no way. What?
No, there's no way. So, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there was a lot of justice sought from those legal efforts, which is just like, on top of everything, like you're a survivor of these schools and of this horrifying abuse. And then, like, it's probably traumatic to relive that in court as well, you know?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And then just to get
only for them to deny your claim, yeah.
Yeah. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, also known as the TRC, was formed, and it collected testimonies of over 6,750 survivors. And you can actually find this on their website, nctr.ca. You can find these testimonies. The 2015 final report made it clear that further recoveries of unmarked graves at schools are inevitable. And it concluded that the Indian residential school system was an attempted cultural genocide. So that's like a huge deal for the government to put that label. Yeah.
It was. While you were saying it, I realized that, this is a way it is genocide. You know, it's a mass grave of Indigenous children. So. And
they're literally trying to eradicate like an entire people,
your culture,
you know?
Yeah. It really is.
So, and additionally, just on June 11th, 2008, Canadian Parliament issued a formal apology for the damage done by residential schools. And just to wrap up, just so we even though there are all these apologies coming out, and it's really great that people are discussing this history more. I'm so excited to listen to the Scrolls and Leaves podcast episode so we can hear more about what's going on in the U.S. I feel like in the U.S. I don't hear anything about our own residential schools. So hopefully we can hopefully this discussion that's happening in Canada kind of trails over into America, and we can talk about our own history with this school system. But because these residential schools heavily contributed to educational, social, financial, and health disparities between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada. And these impacts are intergenerational. It goes on for years and years and years. The residential schools systematically undermine Indigenous people across Canada. they contributed to a general loss of language and culture. And because they were removed from their families, many students grew up without experiencing a nurturing family life and without the knowledge and skills to raise their own families. Which is just, like, to not have a childhood, that's, like, not, you can't, that's nothing, I don't know, like, you can't repay that, or, I don't know what I'm trying to say, like, there's just, you're taking away someone's childhood.
Yeah, there's not a way to fix it.
Yeah.
So much. You took away all their time and their development. So.
Yeah. But that is the Canadian residential school systems. It was a really, really, really heavy, depressing, scary, tragic topic.
You have to talk about it.
We have to talk about it and acknowledge the history, and, like, we can't just let it be forgotten. Even though it's really hard to talk about, you still have to do it and learn about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, can you imagine if it's hard for us with no Indigenous blood to talk about it? Can you imagine how difficult it must be for the communities that are actually affected? But
yeah. And
it's
for,
even
like, the
harder
survivors,
to erase it. Yeah, and act like it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So.
And again,
thank you.
Thank you. Just, again, if you want to check out residential schools in the U.S., please listen to the Scrolls and Leaves podcast for their coverage of, residential schools in the U.S. And, thank you all for listening, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.